Hello and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming Faction Review for Bolt Action. Today we are going to be checking out the British Empire. And if you know anything about World War II, you know that the British were one of the main central belligerents of the Second World War, and that at one point during the war they were the only nation standing up against Germany. Warlord Games is also a British company, so of course the British are going to be very, very well represented in the game of Bolt Action. And as always, we are breaking down this faction review into 4 categories: faction traits, unit variety, flavor, and balance. Faction traits and unit variety being 20 points each category, and flavor and balance being 5 points each, to make up a total score ranking from 0 to 50. Now, in our last review, the Germans scored a solid 45. Let's see how the British stack up against them. Now, we're going to start off with faction traits as always, and these of course are some of the unique traits that alter the play style of the army. Now, usually we rank each of the 4 traits on a level of 0 to 5, which adds up to the total score of 20 for this category. However, the British are pretty unique in this regard. They actually have the national characteristic as an army trait, and if you've ever looked through the Armies of the Great Britain book, you will see that there is a list of 5 unique traits that you can actually select and choose for your army when you build a list for them. Now, that offers a lot of flexibility. So since the British have 2 normal faction traits and then this sort of buffet of traits to choose from, we're going to rank it a little bit differently here. Now, because there are 5 traits to choose from, I was originally thinking of ranking them at 0 to 2 points each, and then tallying them up to a score of potentially 10. However, there are a few traits on here that I think are worth more than 2 points, and while there are some others that I think are only worth 1 point, I think overall it comes out to a solid 10 for the national characteristics points overall, especially when you consider the ability to choose them when you're building your list. It's very flexible. But let's go ahead and look over those national characteristics anyways. Now, the reason the British get these flexible options is basically to represent the diversity of the British Commonwealth that fought in the Second World War. And these are meant to represent, the various peoples, be it the Maori or the Gurkha or the Anzac soldiers who came from around the world to fight in this conflict. And speaking of Gurkha, 3 of these 5 traits are very, very melee-oriented. We'll go ahead and start with Up and Atom, or as I like to call it, Diet Bonsai, or Bonsai Light, as I've heard from other people. And the reason people call it this is because it's vaguely similar to the Japanese national trait that allows you to charge your enemies without having to take a morale test. That means if you have a pin marker on you and you want to just rush into combat and maybe squeeze out a victory against some nearby enemies, you don't need to roll to test to see if you lose that pin marker. In fact, it actually counts as having passed an orders test, which I believe removes a pin for you for free, just like the Bonsai charge. Unfortunately, it does not apply to inexperienced troops that you may take. Nevertheless, it is a great ability to have as a sort of last-ditch maneuver for your infantry when they get close to the enemies. It also kind of ensures you that you're going to make it into close combats with your melee-oriented units like your Gurkhas or your Commandos. That aside, if you're taking Gurkhas or Commandos, which are very expensive units in your list, you are going to have a plan for them, and you are likely not going to need to rely on Bonsai charges, which are more of a sort of last-ditch effort kind of thing to get your guys in close combat. You're likely going to have your Gurkhas moving in transports to get into close combat and jumping out within enemy range. And therefore, I think Up and Atom is maybe one of the lower ranking abilities from this national characteristics list, especially when you have a multitude of other melee options present here. However, the problem with Up and Atom also kind of carries over to the next one, which is Blood Curdling Charge. Now, Blood Curdling Charge just makes it so if you are assaulting an enemy, they cannot react by shooting at you, which can be quite useful. It definitely helps prevent your melee unit from taking loss before you get into combat. But again, if you are taking a melee-oriented list like that, you're going to have a plan for your Gurkhas, your Commandos, and your melee units to get into combats. And even then, it's not that hard to mitigate shooting reactionary shots anyways. because enemies lose that as long as you charge within 6 inches. Again, it's useful, but Up and Atom and Blood Curdling Charge, I think, are just a little too niche to be the one that you take over others. Now, the next two traits are more damage-oriented, and I think they might be the preferred two that people are going to take. First, we have the melee damage-oriented one of Tough as Boots. And Tough as Boots is basically going to work for every 3 men you have in the squad. You're going to get 1 additional attack dice when you're attacking in melee. Now, if you know how melee works in bolt action, you roll to see who kills each other only once, and whoever scores the most kills wins, and the other unit is immediately vaporized. Well, not literally vaporized, maybe if you're playing K-47, but they are removed from the tabletop, with the exception of Fanatics, of course. But even if they are fighting Fanatics, this is going to help you whittle them down quicker. You're upping your attacks, you're upping your chance to get those enemies off the table when you do get into close combats. And like I said, if you're running Gurkhas or Commandos or other units with submachine guns with tough fighters who are going to be tailor-made to get into close combat, you're going to have a plan for getting them in there, and you're going to want to capitalize on their melee once they are in there. And I think because of that, Tough as Boots is going to be one of your go-to main 3 choices for these national characteristics, especially if you're building a melee-oriented list. Then we have the Rapid Fire national characteristic, which is basically the ranged version of Tough as Boots. Now, I actually quite like this one because the rapid fire drilling was actually a technique that British soldiers were trained to do in the Second World War, where rather than taking time to aim, the unit would get in a formation, and they would just let loose their Lee Enfield rifles and crank that bolt as fast as they can, kind of creating just a wall of bullets at nearby enemies at a closer range. But the way that this trait functions is similar to Tough as Boots, where for every 3 riflemen you have firing, you can add 1 more dice to the pool. So if you have a 10-man squad of rifles shooting, you are going to get 3 extra dice added to your pool. And that's pretty good if you think about it. It's almost like a free LMG. That's being a little generous. It's not, you don't have the range of an LMG and you're 1 dice short, but it's pretty nifty to take, and definitely something to consider when you're kitting out your squads with just rifles. And even if you are kitting out your rifle squads with an NCO with a submachine gun and an LMG, which a lot of people, that's kind of the standard way to kit out a rifle squad, you're still going to get 2 extra shots to throw in there. That's definitely upping the dice pool. And upping the dice pool is going to help leverage the statistics in your favor. Definitely a good trait, definitely worth taking, especially if you do not plan on getting into melee with the enemy. Next we have Vengeance, and I think Vengeance is the third alternative to take for your national characteristic. Basically, what Vengeance allows you to do is if your unit has an enemy unit within a foot, 12 inches, upon activation, it can roll a d6, and on a roll of 4+, you remove 1 pin marker from the unit. Then you may proceed with activating as normal. That can not only help you remove more than 1 pin marker in 1 activation without rattling, it can also prevent you from having to take an order test, which you might fail, which is pretty nifty and can definitely help you out, especially in sticky situations where you're getting pin markers laid on you by high explosives and you still need to get your troops in there. Now, 2 things to note about Vengeance. It does not work on inexperienced units. You know why? Because Warlord Games absolutely hates inexperienced models. They are so bad in this game, and there is not a single thing in this game that they want to let help them. It just layers it on. They're already bad, but stuff like that, little side notes on stuff like Vengeance that are like, this does not work with inexperience. It's like, oh great, good. I wasn't planning on taking them anyways. Thank you though. But maybe more significantly is that you don't need to have a line of sight with your enemy to activate this, which is fantastic. And I guarantee you every German player who just read the Tiger Fear errata is grinding their teeth at that fact. So basically for this national characteristics army trait, you have 3 very solid choices to choose from. One that benefits your melee, one that benefits your shooting, and then one that can just kind of benefit your army overall if you use it right. Which one do you guys prefer? Leave a comment below. I want Vengeance to work so badly because I fail so many morale checks in this game. But I swear I have never successfully rolled a 4-up on my vengeance rolls. It's like cursed for me. I don't know. So I've actually started using rapid fire more often. And if you think I'm wrong about Up and Atom or Blood Curdling Charge, let me know and explain your reasoning. But basically, the flexibility of this army trait is netting the British a solid 10 points. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to their two more traditional army special rules, and the first of those is going to be Bombardment. And basically, Bombardment allows you to roll 2 dice when determining the effects of a preparatory bombardment on an enemy unit and picking the better result. So basically, the way a preparatory bombardment begins, you roll a dice to see if it comes in. If you roll anything but a 1, it comes in. You go around the board to each enemy unit in their deployment zone and roll a d6 on them. And essentially, the higher the roll, the more pins and or potential damage you're going to put on that unit. So rolling 2 dice for that and picking the highest is pretty nice. The problem with this national trait comes in when you consider the fact that it's only when you're attacking in an attack and defense scenario that allows preparatory bombardment. It is very situational for the mission at hand. And I don't know how it works in competitive play, but when I play with my group, what we'll usually do is we will take our rulebook out, we'll roll a d6. On a 4+, it'll be a attack and defend mission. On a 1, 2, and 3, it'll be an encounter. And then after that, we'll roll off again to see who is the attacker and who is the defender. So you basically, in really rudimentary terms, you have a 25% chance of actually having a game where you get to use a preparatory bombardment. And because bombardment is so situational, I have to just give it a 2 out of 5. It is good when it comes up, but it's also kind of annoying. You're going to notice that when you play with people, they're going to want to try and not play attack and defend just because of this one army bonus. I think it's somewhat of a poor rule, and it might be fun if you're playing against an army like Italians, but I think their attack and defend scenario rule is a bit more interesting than the British one. And when we discuss balance later on with this faction, this national trait is going to come up again. Now after that, we have the artillery support special rule, and this one is extremely powerful. Basically, every British list is allowed to take 1 free forward artillery observer. Now that's 100-point units, and while they aren't particularly lethal, they are very, very useful. Arty officers have the potential to blanket entire segments of the map with pins, with a bubble ranging from 7 to 12 inches. And if your dice are hot, you can destroy vehicles, level buildings, and send squads running off the tabletop. Now, most of the time, you're just going to put a couple pins on a couple of units. But for free, that's really good. The Artillery Observer is also a unit which gets you an extra activation in your bag. And he has infinite range, so you can keep him in the back fields in a vantage point, and he's going to be, long range, small team, might have him in cover. Your enemies are probably never going to touch him, and that activation dice is going to stay in the bag. It definitely helps pad out your army, and definitely will tar pit your enemy's advance, especially if they bunch up. This artillery officer unit also doesn't take up your platoon slot for him, so you can double down and take 2 artillery observers. And competitive lists do that, and you can really just bog your enemy down and force their entire army to rally for 2, even 3 turns sometimes. It's a very powerful unit to have, especially when you double down on them, which other factions just can't pull off. And again, referring to balance, you're never not going to take this guy, and your opponents are eventually going to get tired of getting hit with those artillery observer rounds every game. I think the US Air Observer trait is a much more fair representation of a rule like this, where you don't get the free unit, you get additional boosts to that unit if you do decide to take it. Artillery barrages, while not as lethal as airstrikes, are also a lot more reliable, and they will almost always come in and they will almost always hit something. I think I've only seen 1 game of my many games of Volt Action where an artillery barrage has scattered off the map. Players have a lot of control where they go and where they show up. And there's no risk of rookie pilots or being shot out of the sky by flak. They're just very, very reliable, and you're always going to see them on a British list because why not take him? He's free. But these gripes are going to affect the flavor and balance portion of this review. Rating this national trait just on its efficiency, It is definitely a solid 5. The Artillery Observer is one of the best army special rules in the game. No question about it. So with Bombardment scoring a 2, Artillery Support scoring a 5, and the plethora of national characteristics scoring a 10, the British are going to have a solid 17 out of 20 on their faction traits. And that brings us to another big, if not the biggest category, and that is unit variety. Again, this is a category worth 20 points broken down into 4 parts. The first being infantry. Now, the British have some of the best representation of infantry in the game. Now, you have your basic inexperienced squad, regular squad, veteran squad, airborne squad. You got those guys in there. They don't have much particularly interesting kits to put on them. You can get your Bren guns in there, you can get your submachine guns. Nothing too exciting, you can't load them up too much like Panzer Grenadiers or things of the sort, but they are still nifty and a good cornerstone for your basic infantry selection. But you also get a very unique and often overlooked inexperienced squad that is the British Home Guard section. Now, I know I usually turn my nose up at inexperienced infantry, but these guys do have the green special rule, which can potentially bump them up to regulars once they take a casualty, and that is definitely worth considering. They also have a beautiful array of weapons that they can equip, including shotguns and unarmed partisans who you can throw in to be your squad's machine gun loader. Definitely not a game-breaking unit, but I think there's a lot of creativity to be had with the British Home Guards that people haven't really tapped into. I definitely have my eyes on them. But where the British Commonwealth's infantry section really shines is with their special forces. And in here you have the Commandos, the Chindits, and of course, the infamous Gurkhas. Now, the Chindits and the Commandos kind of allow you to basically hijack other armies' national traits. Yet again, the Chindits are veteran infantry who can move and shoot without suffering the -1 to hit penalty, much like the US Army Special Rule. But one thing the Chindits can do that the US cannot do is fire light machine guns while on the move without suffering the penalty. It's very potent, and I definitely want to try these guys out more on the field. Now, the Commandos are basically your typical special forces, outflanking behind enemy lines units. They have tough fighters, they can get tank hunters if you wish, but they also get the Vickers K LMG, where you can basically upgrade your light machine gun to have the buzzsaw rule of the German army. You just get an extra dice. Now, of course, these all cost points, and they're all attached to these specific veteran units that are not cheap to take in your list, but it can really give you a lot of variety for your infantry builds and what you want to take. But I digress. Let's talk about Gurkhas. Everyone wants to talk about Gurkhas. The reason Gurkhas are so legendary is because of their Scary Blighters special rule. And what this does, basically, when an enemy attacks them in close combat, their attack number is halved, rounding up. So if you attack a squad of 10 enemies with your Gurkhas, they're only going to be able to punch back with you with 5 of their men. Now, you see how that causes a slight imbalance in the combat when whoever does the most damage wins and the other squad flees immediately. And you compare that with Tough as Boots, and you can definitely see why Gurkhas are so lethal in melee combat. I believe there was a little bit of notoriety around them that occurred during the release of the Western Desert book, because the Mori were a national characteristics in the Western Desert book, which is kind of its own thing, but you could still take Gurkhas according to some like scub in tournament rules. So people were basically able to run Gurkhas with the Scary Blighters rule, with the Blood Curling Charge rule, with Tough as Boots, and with Up and Atom, making this just absolutely ultimate melee unit that could charge in and just obliterate your enemies in close combat. Now, I think that's nerfed, but that being said, not having Up and Atom and Blood Curdling Charge isn't that big of a deal, at least in my opinion. Obviously, it's not quite as good, but I think being able to still take that Tough as Boots makes them so damn good. I also personally believe that melee combat is a little too overpowered with how it works in bolt action, and you can really just delete units from the field way too quickly. Again, in my opinion. But we'll talk more about that when we get to balance. Let's move on to support units. Now, the British get some pretty good infantry support units. They have access to mortars ranging from light all the way up to heavy. Heavy mortars are good, and not that many people get them. You also have the Piat, which might not be as good as the bazooka or the Panzerschreck, but it's still decent, especially considering that it's in its own category. You also have guns like the 25 pounder that can double as a light anti-tank gun and a light howitzer for free. I think that is actually one of the best artillery pieces in the game. You also get some unique things like the 17 pounder that's a super heavy anti-tank gun with a 7-man crew, but I think those are a little too squishy to be worth their points investment. I'd rather have that 17 pounder on a Firefly. But beyond that, you don't get a whole lot of diversity with the British support units. You get all the basics, you get a few things out there like the Blackguard Bomber, but let's be honest, most people aren't taking those in lists because they're horribly ahistorical. And only the British would get that in bolt action, of course. Imagine if other armies got weapon prototypes equivalent to the Blackguard Bomber. You'd have Germans running around with Fliegerfaust and things of that sort. So the British are only getting a 4 on the support units category. They have almost everything you need. The 25 pounder is fantastic. You're going to get what you want and what you need out of this list, but there's nothing too interesting or creative. So we'll move right along into support vehicles. Again, this is wheeled vehicles, transports, recce vehicles, armored car category stuff, things of that sort. And like the Germans, I think the British excel in this category. They have a lot of very cool options that can help pad out shortcomings in your lists. Their transports are especially cool, with the Bren carrier that can take an extra pintle-mounted light machine gun and still have its 5-man carrying capacity. It's a great little support vehicle, and you can take them in the recce variant also. You also get things on top of that like the Deuce, a truck that can carry about 30 soldiers. The Kangaroo, which is a medium tank with its turret removed where you tote around soldiers in it. The armored car selection is also fantastic, with clunkers like the Rolls-Royce interwar vehicles to the Marmon Harrington, all the way up to things like the Humber and the AEC, which vary dramatically in armaments. You can really kit these things out with different weapons, be it autocannons, light AT guns, medium AT guns. Some of them even get the 75 from the Sherman that has the modified high explosive on it. Very good stuff. You get some recce's in there, just nice options. You even get US Lend-Lease vehicles that the US don't even get, like the Staghounds and the Staghound AAs. These were things that the US Army turned down, and they shipped them off to the Brits anyways before the US entered the war. You just have fantastic options of the support vehicles. Honestly, I almost wish I could go higher than 5 for the British with this. But enough gushing over armored cars. Let's move on to the big category of tanks. Now, I have a little bit of personal bias here where I have a British 8th Army, and I am not a fan of a lot of tanks we get in the desert. There's just a lot of clunkers that they used. And unfortunately, even great tanks like the Matilda aren't very fantastically represented in the bolt action rules. The early war British tanks and a lot of the mid-war ones had this sort of problem where almost every tank was outfitted with a 2-pounder or 6-pounder. All that said, when I was looking through the rule book to brush up for this review, I realized the Brits do have a solid amount of options for tanks. I think one of the core anchors to the British tanks is the Churchill tank and the amount of variance we get on that. Everyone wants the Crocodile. I get it. The Crocodile's cool. It's also about 500 points, so it's going to give you a little bit of trouble getting your points back with that. However, you get options like the option to choose between it being a heavy or super heavy, or having a 6-pounder, or having a howitzer, or having the AVRE variant, which is one of my personal favorites with the Flying Dustbin. You also get things like the Firefly, and of course, all of the Lend-Lease tanks. You get access to most of the US ones. Now, I'm tempted to brush that one off because you don't get the amazing gyro stabilizers that the Shermans can make use of in the American Army, but you still do get access to all of them. You get great tanks like the Chaffee and the Sherman, and the M3 Lee and or Grant. So I gotta say, the British have earned a 5 in the tank category. So with every category other than support units scoring a 5 in the unit variety category, the British get a nice 19 out of 20 here, and again, that is very good, not just from a gameplay standpoint, but from a collector's standpoint. But that moves us along to our final 2 minor categories of flavor and balance. Now, for flavor, I'm not too big on how the British are represented on the tabletop. You have the emphasis on artillery, which sure the British did have, but almost every army in World War II that wasn't the German army had that entering the war. You can even see that represented in the French doctrine getting the free medium artillery piece. As far as the national characteristics army trait goes, it's a little too vague and watery for me. It's cool that you have different traits to represent different Commonwealth factions, but more often than not, you're just going to be taking the one that most suits your list and not one that actually represents the nation you're playing. When they released the Western Desert book, they did a much better job of fleshing out each nationality and culture that fought in the British Army, but we're not reviewing that. We're reviewing the base British Army here, and I think it's just not that exciting, although they definitely get points for taking other nations into consideration, so I'm giving the flavor a 3 out of 5 points here. Not terrible, but definitely leaves more to be desired, especially from one of the central factions of the game. And lastly, we're on to balance. This is a major point where the British are going to get dinged. People talk about British bias from Warlord games, and I don't necessarily think it's intentional, but I think it is a problem with the British Army. As I mentioned with the artillery support and bombardment special rule, it's something that's going to get old for your opponents if you're going to a gaming club or you have a group of friends that you're playing with. You got to take that observer. It's your national trait. If you don't take it, you're sacrificing one of the biggest benefits of your army, but your opponents are going to get exhausted by being shelled by artillery every single match you play. And I think the bombardment special rule is even worse, where people are going to specifically avoid playing attack and defense scenarios to not get that extra pounding that rule provides. Alternatively, if you're a British player, you're going to be yearning to play those scenarios, and other people might not want to, or you'll get unlucky and you'll end up on the defending side, and then it just kind of ends up in the situation where you're just kind of like, well, that's a shame. I think it's unfortunately just not a fun rule. And while I'm not wholly against the free artillery observer, I would much prefer a better artillery observer that you still have to buy, which is more in line with the US Air Observer trait. On top of that, you get the Gurkhas, which exploits one of the game's most overexploited mechanics, that is melee combat. I don't have an aversion against them. It's nice that you get the variety that can change your playstyle, but it is a bit too cheeky for my liking. And because of that, the British are scoring a mere 2 on the balance scale. Not the worst score, mainly due to the national characteristics being a little lackluster, but definitely not ideal. But let's go ahead and look over the categories again real quick and tally up the score that the British get for bolt action. In your faction's army traits, you're going to score a solid 17 out of 20. That's pretty good. Not perfect, though. And unit variety, you're getting an ideal 19 out of 20. That's close to perfect. And again, in one of the biggest categories. In flavor, you're getting just 3 out of 5. That's a little lackluster, again, especially for one of the core belligerents of the Second World War. And then in balance, you're getting a meager 2 out of 5, which brings the British to a score of 41. Again, I think most of the primary factions of bolt action are going to be scoring in the 40s range. It is sad to see the British, the underdogs of the Second World War, sit so low on that list, though. But I think they do need a bit of reviews when they get revamped for the next edition. Because at the moment, their abilities are either just a little too powerful or just kind of bland or situational. And as someone who collects Africa Corps and Desert Rats, I definitely feel that with the army. I know I'm limited to that sort of early mid-war selections, so I'm a little more tight on what I can equip my lists with. But the Germans are on the same boat with that regard, and I still have more fun list building and playing with them over the British. Nevertheless, I love the 8th Army models that Warlord has came out with, and the British have great representation through Warlord models and other miniature manufacturers. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think the British deserve higher than a 41? Do you think I overvalued or undervalued any of their units? Do you think Gurkhas are extremely annoying? Do you have a guy in your group who has that artillery officer, and are you sick of being shelled by artillery every game? Let me know, leave a comment, leave a like. If you guys want to see more content like this, consider subscribing and clicking the notifications button. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.